Hey mystery lovers. I'm just here to haunt you with some creepy stories that'll send chills down your spine. Before we start, hit subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's get started. I caught the last bus by pure accident, though even now, part of me wonders whether it was a mistake or something deliberate. The bus, its legend, and what it truly is have haunted me since that fateful night. Everyone in my town grows up hearing tales of the last bus. It's one of those urban myths that creep into your consciousness, whispered in hushed tones over campfires or in dimly lit rooms during sleepovers. You know the kind of story that makes you check the dark corners of your bedroom before switching off the light. My friends and I treated these legends as gospel when we were kids, daring each other to investigate. Over time, though, reality wore us down. You can only chase so many shadows before you start to feel foolish. But this was no shadow. The town where I grew up is as ordinary as they come. Rows of tired buildings, a drab high street, and a population that seems perpetually bored. It's no wonder urban legends thrive here. For us kids, they were an escape, the only form of adventure available. Tales like the vanishing hitchhiker, the South Side Troll Man, and the White Lady of Croft Manor kept us entertained through long, uneventful summers. We convinced ourselves that maybe, just maybe, they were real. The last bus was one of those tales, but unlike the rest, it didn't promise adventure, it promised fear. According to the legend, this bus isn't listed on any timetable, and it doesn't pick up passengers from the main depot. It appears only after the official last bus has departed, prowling the city's shadowed streets. They say it stops for no one unless you're truly lost, truly desperate. And once you step aboard, you might not come back. The city center transforms at night. By 1 a.m., when the pubs and clubs eject their drunken patrons, the streets become a chaotic mess of fights, spilled drinks, and slurred confessions. The last real bus leaves at 11:45 p.m., a lifeline for anyone who doesn't want to face the pandemonium. But for those who linger, those who lose track of time or revel too long, the twilight hours begin. At this time, the streets belong to two groups, the vulnerable and the predators. The homeless seek refuge in alleys and doorways, curling up in makeshift beds while trying to stay invisible. Then there are the human monsters, the gangs looking for trouble, the men stalking their prey. Monday morning headlines often tell their stories, the brutal assaults, the shattered lives. Back then, I believed that these human predators were the worst things out there. How could I have known what truly owned the night? It was a Saturday, one of those nights when plans fall apart. My friends had all left early, and my phone was dead, so I found myself wandering the darkened streets alone. The chaos of the bar crowd had already died down, leaving the city eerily quiet. I wasn't scared, at least, not yet. The human predators were still out there, sure, but I was more annoyed at myself for missing the last bus. My apartment was miles away, and taxis were too expensive. And then, as if answering my unspoken plea, I saw it. The bus emerged from the darkness, its headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in without warning. It wasn't one of the city's usual buses. Its body was ancient, the paint chipped and peeling, its windows dark and reflective. No route number, no destination. Just the last bus. It slowed as it approached, hissing to a stop. The door creaked open, and warm air, too warm, rushed out. For reasons I can't fully explain, I stepped aboard. The interior was wrong. The lighting flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cracked leather seats. The smell was faint but unpleasant, like mildew mixed with something metallic. The driver didn't look at me, just nodded toward the rows of seats. I dropped a few coins into the fare box, and he grunted in response. There were other passengers, but they weren't like any I'd seen before. They sat too still, their heads bowed, faces obscured by shadows. One woman clutched a tattered handbag, her knuckles white. A man stared straight ahead, his eyes wide and unblinking. No one acknowledged me as I stumbled down the aisle and took a seat near the back. The bus began to move, and that's when I realized the truth. The city streets we passed weren't right. The buildings were twisted, their windows shattered, their walls scorched. The streetlights flickered, casting unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. I wanted to get off, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, as if the bus itself was holding me in place. The passengers began to stir. One by one, they turned their heads toward me. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. I felt their gaze pierce through me, and suddenly, I understood, they weren't passengers. They were victims. People who had boarded this bus, just like me, and never found their way back. The driver's face was the last thing I saw before I blacked out. His grin was impossibly wide, his teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. "Welcome," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You were just in time." I woke up hours later, sprawled on the pavement outside my apartment. My clothes were torn, my hands covered in cuts and bruises. My mind was a haze of terror and confusion. The bus was gone, as if it had never existed. But I knew better. Since that night, I've seen its shadow in the distance, its headlights gleaming faintly in the fog. I don't stay out late anymore. I don't let myself get lost. But the fear never leaves me. I know it's out there, waiting for the next desperate soul. The last bus isn't just an urban legend. It's real. And once you step aboard, there's no guarantee you'll ever return. The first time I boarded the night bus was on the loneliest night of my life. I had just turned 21, and the weight of heartbreak pressed heavily on my chest after the bitter end of a 2-year relationship. My friends, in their well-meaning way, had dragged me out for a night of distractions, music, drinks, and dimly lit clubs. But the attempt to cheer me up had only deepened my misery. By the time I stumbled out of the club, I was more a walking ghost than a man, my mind swimming in alcohol and regret. I wandered the empty streets, weaving through pools of dim orange light cast by flickering street lamps. At some point, I found myself at a deserted bus shelter, collapsing onto the cold metal bench. The alcohol hit me in waves, pulling me into a restless sleep. When I woke, hours must have passed. The streets were eerily silent, bathed in a sickly, unnatural glow. My body shivered, and I rubbed my arms, looking around. The world felt wrong, too still, too empty. And then I saw it, a black silhouette moving through the fog. The bus. It rumbled toward me, belching thick, black smoke that lingered unnaturally in the air. Its headlights pierced through the mist like accusing eyes. The vehicle was old, its body dented and its paint cracked, a relic of a bygone era. It shouldn't have been on the streets. No logo. No destination lit up on the sign above the windshield. Just a hulking shadow rolling toward me, its engine growling low, like a predator sizing me up. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my body wouldn't obey. The bus creaked to a stop. Its door swung open with an unsettling hiss, and out stepped the driver. He wasn't what I expected. He wore a blue uniform, clean and pressed, as though he belonged to some long-defunct company. His face was friendly, a soft, fatherly smile, twinkling eyes. But something about him felt off. A hint of wrongness beneath the surface, like a mask stretched too tightly over something darker. "Good evening, my friend," he said, his voice warm and smooth, yet hollow. "Are you coming aboard?" My throat tightened. My mind raced. Where does this bus go?" "Home," he said simply, his smile never faltering. "Eventually." His words lingered, heavy with a meaning I couldn't grasp. Before I could think better of it, I found myself nodding. He stepped aside, motioning me in. As I crossed the threshold, a cold shiver crept up my spine. The door hissed shut behind me like the ceiling of a tomb. The interior of the bus was no less strange than its exterior. Dim, flickering lights cast long shadows across rows of worn, leather seats. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Other passengers sat scattered throughout, silent, unmoving figures. Their faces were obscured by the gloom, but their presence weighed heavily, as though the very act of acknowledging them might draw something malignant. I chose a seat close to the front, my eyes darting nervously. The driver glanced back at me once, his expression unreadable, before turning to face the road. As the bus jerked into motion, the world outside became a blur. Familiar streets slipped away, replaced by desolation, crumbling buildings, hollowed-out structures, and broken streetlights that cast uneven pools of light. And then, the passengers began to stir. The first to approach was a young woman, a vision of disheveled beauty. Her cocktail dress shimmered under the weak light, her heels clicking softly as she made her way toward me. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, and her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. But it was her scent that unnerved me, a sweet, cloying perfume mingled with the acrid tang of alcohol and something faintly rotten. "Hey," she whispered, sliding into the seat beside me. Her voice was soft, almost musical. Rough night? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She smiled, a sad, almost predatory curve of her lips. Me too, she said, leaning closer. Her hand brushed my arm, her touch cold and lingering. You seem nice. Maybe you'd like to come with me? I don't want to be alone tonight. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Somewhere deep inside, I knew I should refuse. Her eyes gleamed too brightly, her smile too wide. But her story poured out before I could react, a tale of abuse, heartbreak, and loss that made my own pain feel trivial. I can make it better, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Come with me. No, I croaked, my voice trembling. Her face crumpled, a mix of sorrow and anger flashing across her features. She slumped back into her seat, sobbing softly, her hands covering her face. I moved away, forcing myself to ignore her cries. Next came the old woman. She shuffled down the aisle, dragging a battered shopping cart behind her. Her smile was warm, grandmotherly, and she smelled of lavender, though it was tinged with decay. She spoke softly, her stories a soothing balm against the oppressive atmosphere. But when she asked me to help her home, her voice grew sharp, insistent. When I refused, her kind demeanor shattered. Her face twisted into a mask of rage, her voice a guttural snarl as she hurled curses at me. I stumbled away, her hateful words ringing in my ears. Toward the back of the bus sat the drunkard, a filthy, unkempt man with wild eyes. He laughed as I approached, his voice slurred but strangely compelling. He spoke of life and death, of fate and choice, his words weaving a tapestry of dark truths that gnawed at my sanity. He offered me a drink, a silver flask that gleamed in the dim light. The scent was intoxicating, promising blissful oblivion. I hesitated, but the memory of the party girl's touch stopped me. When I refused, his smile vanished. His eyes burned with hatred, his laughter turning to a low, menacing growl. You'll regret this, he spat. You don't know what's waiting for you. The ride continued, a nightmare of shadowy landscapes and malevolent whispers. The passengers grew restless, their gazes hungry. I kept my head down, my heart pounding. When the bus finally screeched to a halt, I stumbled out into the familiar glow of my street. The driver smiled as the doors closed behind me. Until next time, he said, his voice echoing in my mind long after the bus disappeared into the darkness. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that there would be a next time. The air on the bus grew heavier as I sank into my seat, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. My thoughts spiraled, replaying the encounter with the Harbinger in sharp, disjointed flashes. The burning eyes, the stench of decay, the guttural growls of that monstrous hound, all still fresh in my mind. Yet it wasn't over. Not yet. As the bus rumbled down the shadowy road, I glanced out the window, desperate for any sign of familiarity. But the landscape outside was shifting in ways that defied logic. Trees bent unnaturally toward the bus, their skeletal branches scraping against the glass like claws trying to tear their way in. The fog thickened, swirling with strange shapes, faces, and whispers I could almost, but not quite, make out. Each muffled voice seemed to know my name, hissing it with mockery, hatred, and longing. I shut my eyes tightly, clutching the edge of my seat, praying silently that this nightmare would end. That's when the driver's voice sliced through the suffocating tension. Everything all right back there? His tone was oddly cheerful, a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom. I opened my eyes and turned to face him, and for the first time, I noticed something was off. His hands on the wheel weren't hands at all. They were blackened, skeletal, with tendons that stretched too tight over jagged bone. I froze, unable to respond, as he chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that sent shivers down my spine. Don't worry, he added, his hollow eyes glancing at me through the rearview mirror. You were almost home. Home. The word barely registered. I glanced down the aisle, hoping to find solace in the emptiness, but something had changed. The seats, previously worn and mundane, now bled with a dark, viscous liquid that pooled on the floor. The windows seemed alive, warping and pulsing like living skin stretched too thin. A sudden, sharp laugh echoed from somewhere behind me, a laugh that didn't belong to any human throat. I whipped around, heart hammering, but the rows were empty. Or so I thought. As I squinted into the darkness, I noticed them, shadowy figures sitting silently in the seats. They were more outlines than people, flickering in and out like old static on a TV screen. Their heads turned slowly, in unison, black holes where their faces should have been, and I knew they were watching me. Before I could scream, the bus jerked violently, nearly tossing me into the aisle. The driver slammed the brakes, the vehicle screeching to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic tapping of something, or someone, against the glass door at the front of the bus. Tap, tap, tap. The driver turned his eyeless gaze toward the door and grinned, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. "Looks like we have another passenger," he said, his voice dripping with glee. He reached for the lever and opened the door, the hiss of hydraulics cutting through the oppressive stillness. I held my breath as the figure boarded, each step heavy and deliberate. It wasn't the Harbinger, not this time. This was something else. The figure was cloaked in a tattered shroud, its head hidden beneath a hood. But from beneath it had came a sound, a low, wet rattling like lungs filled with water. As it passed me, the air grew impossibly cold, and the scent of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils. The creature stopped abruptly, turning its hooded head toward me. My chest tightened as I felt its gaze pierce through me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. Its hand, a skeletal, clawed appendage, emerged from the cloak, pointing directly at me. The whispering voices from outside grew louder, forming a single, chilling word that echoed inside my head: remember. Suddenly, the lights on the bus flickered violently. The shadowy passengers began to writhe and scream, their voices an agonized cacophony. The creature at the front turned sharply and retreated down the steps, its movements jerky and unnatural. The driver slammed the door shut, his grotesque grin now gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. The bus roared to life and sped forward, faster than seemed possible. The world outside became a blur of darkness and fire, and the whispers gave way to unearthly howls. I clutched the seat in front of me, my knuckles white, as the vehicle seemed to defy physics, lurching and twisting through impossible turns. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The bus was quiet again, the air still and lifeless. I opened my eyes cautiously, half expecting to see the fiery abyss of hell outside. But instead, I saw the familiar streets of my neighborhood. The driver turned to face me, his skeletal features now softened into something almost human. He tipped his hat, his voice low and gravelly. "Your stop, friend. Make it count." I didn't wait to be told twice. I stumbled out of the bus, collapsing onto the wet pavement. With a mix of relief and dread, I stepped off the bus that fateful night, the cool night air like a baptism after my descent into something unholy. The world seemed ordinary again, crickets chirped in the distance, and the faint hum of streetlights filled the silence. Yet, the mundane felt alien, like I'd been absent from it far longer than a few hours. My heart pounded, and I turned back, catching one last glimpse of the bus. The driver leaned out of his window, his skeletal grin illuminated by the pale moonlight. "Good night," he rasped. "We'll see each other again." With that, the bus vanished into the fog, taking with it a piece of me. I stood frozen, a chilling certainty creeping into my bones. I hadn't escaped. Not really. The encounter had etched itself into my soul, a curse I couldn't shake. For years, I've tried to move on. I avoided lonely roads, steered clear of buses altogether, and pretended the Harbinger was a nightmare, a manifestation of my overactive imagination. But the dreams wouldn't let me forget. Every night, I was back on that cursed bus, trapped between rows of faceless passengers as the Harbinger's hound stalked closer. Its growls echoed in my ears long after I woke. Eventually, my fear gave way to a relentless curiosity. I told myself it was better to confront the unknown than live in its shadow. The Harbinger had answers, I was sure of it. Answers to questions I didn't yet know how to ask. I sought the bus again, combing desolate highways under moonless skies. It took years, but I caught it, twice. Both times, I boarded with trepidation, wary of the traps laid by the shadowed passengers. Their hollow eyes followed my every step, but I avoided their snares. On both occasions, I waited for the Harbinger, but he refused to leave his wretched shelter. Frustration clawed at me as I stepped off, my questions unanswered. Still, I couldn't give up. I won't give up. Tonight, I'll seek the phantom bus once more. My preparations are meticulous, charms to ward off the shadow passengers, a flask of salt water, and a notebook to record every detail. I know the risks. One night, I may board and never return, becoming just another ghostly passenger. But that is a risk I'm willing to take. I must know the truth. The clock strikes midnight as I stand on the edge of a fog-drenched road, the air thick with a foreboding stillness. Then I hear it, the low hum of an engine, the hiss of air brakes, and the mournful creak of a door swinging open. The phantom bus has arrived. I step on board, my breath hitching as the oppressive atmosphere wraps around me like a shroud. The rows of seats stretch endlessly, and the passengers, those dark, silent figures, are waiting. Their faces, or lack thereof, are a void that seems to swallow the dim light. I grip the rail, forcing myself to move forward. My seat is always waiting for me, the same spot near the middle. As I sit, the driver's voice rings out. "Back for more, are we?" He drawls, his empty eyes flicking to me in the rearview mirror. His grin is sharper now, more predatory. "Careful what you wish for." The bus lurches forward, and the ride begins. The world outside is a twisted panorama, trees morphing into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Shadows ripple across the windows, faces pressing against the glass before vanishing into the fog. I clutch my notebook tightly, scribbling every detail, every sound, every shift in the air. My hands tremble, but I refuse to let fear paralyze me. Tonight, I will not leave until the Harbinger answers me. As the ride stretches on, the temperature drops. Frost creeps over the windows, and my breath hangs in the air. The passengers begin to stir. Their movements are subtle at first, a tilt of the head, a twitch of a hand. But soon, they're turning toward me, their hollow eyes boring into my soul. The whispers start, low and insidious, like 100 voices speaking at once. They tell me secrets, truths I'm not meant to know. My name is among them, repeated like a curse. I press my hands over my ears, but the whispers seep into my mind, unstoppable. Then, the bus halts. The door creaks open, and the Harbinger steps on board. He is taller than I remember, his form shrouded in darkness that seems to writhe like living shadows. His hound pads beside him, its eyes burning like embers. The Harbinger's gaze locks onto mine, and time seems to freeze. His presence is a gravity, pulling everything toward him. "You've been persistent," he says, his voice like the grinding of stones. "But are you ready for the truth?" My mouth goes dry. I nod, unable to speak. The Harbinger reaches out a hand, his fingers impossibly long, and gestures for me to follow. "Then come," he says. "But know this, once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you know, you cannot return." I stand, my legs trembling, and follow him toward the back of the bus. The whispers grow louder, the shadows deeper. As I step into the unknown, the last thing I hear is the driver's raspy laugh. "Good luck," he says, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. "You are going to need it." And that's it for today's story. But you know, the mysteries we uncover? They never really end, they linger, don't they? Waiting, hiding, in the shadows. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, go ahead, hit subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss the next tale, the one that might just keep you up at night. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and hey, never stop questioning the world around you. See you in the next one.